Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. Hey folks, it's Spencer Clavin. You're about to listen to this week's episode of the Roundtable. We recorded this one on Wednesday, the 23rd of February in the afternoon, and it was an episode with just myself and Seth Barron. The other guys were out. We were discussing the Canadian trucker protest and the Russian military moves on the border of Ukraine. And you'll hear me say near the beginning of our conversation that we didn't know how fast events in Ukraine were going to accelerate. And that turned out to be really true. We did not know just how quickly things were going to move until later that night. Back on Wednesday, when we were recording in the afternoon, Putin had only recognized the independence of two separatist states in the east of Ukraine. You'll hear us talking about that. Now, of course, as you are listening, he has launched all-out war. So one of the things you'll hear us speculating about on this podcast is the extent of Putin's ambitions in Ukraine. We didn't know whether or not he meant to invade the whole thing, and we were talking about what the various options might mean for his aims. But obviously, at this point, that question is being answered. It's clear that he does mean to invade all of Ukraine. For my personal money, as I think I imply already on the podcast, this proves that in addition to being a dissident, jailing, political opposition poisoning, former KGB tyrant, Putin is also pretty serious about expanding the scope of his territory at the expense of other countries' sovereignty. But what I really want to make clear is that neither my personal views on this, nor Seth's, nor our discussion together represent the final or official word of the American mind or the Claremont Institute on this rapidly developing situation. You'll hear more from the rest of us on the site with more developed and institutional responses. But for now, we hope that you'll get some value out of Seth's and my pre-war discussion of what the whole thing should mean for America and the state of our own affairs internally. Thanks for listening. Welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly editors and publishers podcast of the American mind. Well, it's only 2 weeks into my reign of terror, but things are already beginning to deteriorate rapidly. Everybody except for one of us has defected. No, everybody's just out today doing various things. So we're missing James, we're missing Ryan, we're missing Matt, but I am joined as always by our managing editor, Seth Barron, all the way from New York. Seth, you learn where your true friends are, where the real loyalties lie when you start to take power, and then people defect. So I'm glad you're still with me.
Oh, absolutely. You can always count on me in any palace coup, any kind of Reichstag fire. I'll be there.
Fantastic. Well, we've got plenty on offer, plenty going around these days for you to join in on. I'm Spencer Clavin, noted insurrectionist and features editor of The American Mind, associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And there's really only two items in the news today. We were talking about what to discuss at the beginning of the show, as we always do, and it's sort of unavoidable to talk about the two big things, Canada and Russia. There have been a lot of sort of back and forths on Twitter between various conservative factions over which of these two news items should hoover up most of our attention, which we should pay most attention to. But here at the American Mind, we're bringing you the big brain takes, and our brains are big enough to pay attention to them both. So we're going to talk about them both, but we're going to start with Russia and Ukraine. This is a developing situation, ongoing crisis, months, some might even say years in the making, but now seeming to accelerate. So by the time you hear this, there's probably going to be plenty of other stuff that has gone down. But where we are at this exact moment, recording on Wednesday, President Vladimir Putin of Russia has recognized the independence of two so-called separatist territories, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, they call themselves, and he has ordered troops into these territories in order to sort of potentially begin his incursion into the country more generally. He's got troops in place to do much more than this. It seems that the White House thinks he's gearing up to do much more than this. The West is beginning to respond with sanctions toward these separatist territories. There's talk of skyrocketing energy prices. Of course, as a result of all of this, Putin is saying that in Europe, gas prices could go up as much as 2 times as much. When Jen Psaki was asked about the effects of this in the US, she said rather lamely, well, standing up for our values is not without cost, which leads me into my first question for you, Seth. What exactly are our values here, and what are we standing up for? Because I'm a little confused.
That's a good question. It doesn't seem like they're really standing. I mean, are they doing anything? I mean, I guess, yes. Okay, they are imposing some sanctions, although I gather they're not even as strict as they could be.
Right.
The other thing is, from my understanding, Russia already had troops or soldiers in those areas. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the idea is that now they're looking at them as like countries that they could potentially be in allegiance with against supposed Ukrainian aggression.
Okay, but typically when you invade another country, you have to be prepared to fight an insurgency.
Right.
Like Russia invaded Afghanistan, we invaded Vietnam, we invaded Iraq, we invaded Afghanistan, and you have to fight like a hostile population. It's not clear to me that, like, if you invade someplace and you have no fear of fighting a hostile population,
right?
What kind of invasion is it? I mean, I don't really want to, get into this whole question of, the limits of Russian sovereignty and what is the self-determination of the people of Eastern Ukraine. I'm not going to pretend that I know a lot about it, but it doesn't seem like the people there are actually that upset about. Like, I think a third of them have Russian passports.
Right.
So I don't really know where are we supposed to where are our values supposed to lie?
Right. I mean, like most people on commenting about this on Twitter, I too am not an expert on Ukrainian-Russian relations. I came across an interesting passage in Solzhenitsyn recently. I guess he had Ukrainian heritage, and he comments on this in the third volume of the Gulag Archipelago, sort of to the effect of, well, we ought to let them kind of make a go of it and self-determine by region, essentially, which ostensibly, is kind of what Putin is saying is happening here. I mean, he's also sort of saying that this is not a real country and that it was made up by the Soviet Union and that he's just sort of re-assimilating these people back into the warm arms of Mother Russia, which, as you say, Seth, it's really not in any way our business to adjudicate those various claims, except to say that if it's not just a matter of, these two provinces, but actually a matter of like Russian expansionism, then we could seriously have a problem on our hands just because Putin's no good. But the sanction thing is kind of interesting. Like it seems to me like if they really wanted to throw their economic weight around, the irony is that what they would do is exactly the Trump thing, right? I mean, Trump's policy on this was to aggressively pursue American energy independence, hence Keystone, hence, Germany has halted this Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That's where some of our sanctions are directed, but it just doesn't seem feasible that the Biden administration would ever be able to stomach basically just taking the Trump line on energy.
No, not at all. And that's the funny thing is, aren't we buying? I mean, is it not the case that the United States is buying energy from Russia?
I think that's the whole point. Yeah.
I mean, so like, what the hell? Like, we're like by eliminating the Trump policies regarding fracking and extraction and drilling, we've enriched Putin and given him all this leverage. So it just seems idiotic. But, if you look, I mean, for my sins, I've been spending a lot of time looking at like crazy Twitter, like all of the never Trumpers and
Welcome.
and all of
We're
the
so glad to have you, Seth.
and I've been looking at all of the like there's this whole group of women who claim, like these so-called experts who throughout the Trump years were always like, detailing precisely at what point he became Putin's agent. Was it 1982 or 1987? And these types.
Yeah.
And according to them, like, well, if you think gas is too expensive, well, then maybe you shouldn't own a car. And maybe a lot of people are celebrating this. They're like, well, this is good. This will move us towards green energy and move us to electric cars. This whole thing of just basically pushing combustion up the line. My car doesn't run on gas; it runs on electricity. So that means that all that means though is that they're generating the electricity using carbon somewhere else. I don't know. The whole thing. Look, I mean, I don't want to become like one of these people who, then now they can say, oh, I'm just spouting Moscow's line. But do any Americans really care about this, except aside from like the Ukraine expert community and like the MIC, like the military industrial complex people who, have been just like slavering for war for years? You tell me.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think that it used to be kind of conventional wisdom, just assumed going wisdom, that American policy should basically take our direct national security interests into account, and that we should, otherwise be of, have an eye toward the rest of the world, but not be in the business of sort of seeking out monsters to destroy. Or another kind of classic shibboleth here, isn't it? Is like, we're the friends of liberty everywhere, but defenders only of our own, or whatever. So there's definitely just a kind of, there are all sorts of reasons why a certain professional class might be super trigger happy about war here without any real interest in the American people. One of them is like to distract from Biden's many other failures. Another would just be, as you say, a kind of military industrial complex hunger for all of this. And yeah, I on that score, it seems that we've completely lost the plot, like just the sort of basic common sense, are we the policemen of the world? No, we are a great power with our own interests that we can put first, right? I mean, it's impossible now to even advance that claim and not be laughed out of court. But it does seem like when Americans are hurting in so many other ways and have so many concerns that are much more direct for them, that like, only the elements of this conflict that threaten us, namely the energy stuff and the potential of like an expansionist Russia in allegiance with China and emboldened to attack us, and Iran, I should add in there. Like that stuff, I think, it would be valid for Americans to be worried about that. The rest of it, the minute adjudication of claims in between like Ukrainian separatists and the history of like Scythia in antiquity and the Holodomor and like, just name any number of things that most Americans like don't know or care about. And it's really not their job to, as much as we might feel for humanitarian crises all over the world, it's really our job to take care of ourselves first and foremost, as at least insofar as we are a nation. I mean, the other aspect of this, which somebody pointed out, that one of our colleagues at CRB, whom I won't mention because I don't know if he wants to be quoted on this just yet, but he was pointing out like it's really kind of inconvenient. And this speaks to your point, Seth, about the crazy people on Twitter. It's kind of inconvenient that we are now up against this major crisis in a region that the professional political class has just spent like 6 years just outright lying about. I mean, we now know that Russiagate was just an actual lie. Like they knew it was a lie. They said it anyway. When we found out that it was a lie, they continued to say that Trump was in Putin's pocket. That the opposite of that has now proven to be true. Like it does seem as if this is an area in which, in addition to not particularly caring about the local politics, Americans are likely to be quite wary of any kind of so-called conventional wisdom that the professional political class is now going to give them about, like, oh, we need to go to war here.
Well, you would think that would be the case, but like, in my investigations of the crazy Twitter people, they don't see it that way at all. They see this, like, you would think that they might be a little bit embarrassed that, okay, well, they spent all this time saying that Trump was Putin's puppet. Yet it was under Obama that Putin invaded Crimea, and now it's under Biden that he's invaded Ukraine proper. But when Trump was president, Biden didn't invade at all. So you'd think that would make them think twice about who's Putin's friend. But no, they claim that, well, Putin didn't have to invade under Trump because Trump was already doing his bidding by weakening NATO.
Right.
Of course, like, he was weakening NATO by having them pay more.
Right.
So increasing funding. And, they're just saying all kinds of crazy stuff in there about, Trump, talking all about Trump's history of enriching himself in Russia and Ukraine. Meanwhile, didn't we it's well established that Hunter Biden was making $1 million a year working for this Ukrainian gas company. And
sure.
This hasn't, nobody's mentioned this.
Nobody has. That is an amazing thing that is just not part of this discussion, even on the right, really, like, except at, the occasional smart aleck tweet. But like, this is a story that was actively suppressed during the election, which now has some, tangential but non-negligible bearing on one of the major crises of Biden's presidency.
You would think. Yeah, it doesn't really make an enormous amount of sense to me. Like yesterday, I think it was Rick Wilson or one of those other bozos over at the Bulwark.
Oh, yeah.
He tweeted, like, sigh. Clearly, the big story today would be for reporters to demand that Republican lawmakers opine on Trump's praise of Putin for invading Ukraine, but nobody's gone ahead and picked up this story. Like, how is that the big story of? It kind of
because Trump is still the president in their
right.
mind.
Well, that's what they're talking. That's the way they talk. Like,
right.
Trump is still the president,
right?
And he's the one who set this all up. This is all being done to disrupt, Biden. I don't know. They keep talking about how. Here's another question. It's like, what the hell is NATO? Why is NATO? Look at the expansion of NATO. Like, why are Poland, Bulgaria, Czech Republic, like all these countries that border, like the Baltics, like, what are they doing? Obviously, I'm not going to say, oh, well, obviously the only threat there would be Russia. But is Russia really a threat to NATO? Apparently I haven't been watching it, but on television, they're just going hard, like, on the Putin-Hitler analogies.
Yeah.
This is the Sudetenland. This is occupation of the Rhineland or whatever. This is, complete, Biden mustn't be Neville Chamberlain.
Right.
But what the hell do they really want war?
Right.
Like, what do they expect to happen?
That is why I began by asking you, like, what exactly are our values and principles here? Is like that part of the question seems completely confused to me, irrespective of the various minutiae that we were just sort of discussing. And like, it is amazing the sort of closed system that you're describing. And I'm sure that there are people, crazies in the fringe of the right who are like this too, but when you really go down Twitter rabbit holes, you can find people for whom every event is evidence that, like, Trump is in cahoots with Russia, even evidence that Biden is actively capitulating to him. But yeah, this thing where, like, well, if he expands beyond Ukraine and then he ends up, taking Poland, because this is also, his history repeats itself, and then we'll be in this, then we'll really be under threat because NATO, like that seems like an irrelevancy to me. I mean, naturally, when you said what is NATO, I promptly Googled NATO, not because not to be clear, because I don't know what it is, but because I was curious what NATO's answer to that question is. And here's their like SEO text, like the text that they want people to find when you Google them. This is something that if you run a website, you pay a lot of attention to like what that little slug is going to be under your main homepage. So I just Googled NATO and it says NATO homepage, NATO and climate change. How is NATO as a security organization contributing to international climate efforts, and what more can the alliance do? I mean, I if James were here, I would imagine the sort of rant that he would go on about, like this is the sort of imperial theological project, is this sort of new world order, and that's what we're really expected to go to war for here. But yeah, in reality land, like absolutely not. Like I can totally see engaging in sanctions. I can totally see like having concern about this issue and wanting to watch it closely, and ideally not getting into this position in the first place by electing Joe Biden. But like short of that, I can see sanctions and all that. But like sending people to die after we just had this disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, 20 years of blood and treasure, like you sort of poured into the sand, like sending more warm bodies, living people to die for like the territories of Ukraine. I cannot imagine that people want that.
Well, I can't imagine that the American people want that. I can imagine that there's some people in Alexandria and, points around there, like in Washington, who think it's a great idea, right, and who see it basically as their job and the job of the media right now to really stir the loins of the American people to get them furious,
right,
about this. I don't think it's going to happen.
Right.
By the way, well, two things. One, I saw this clip of Putin, and I don't know if you saw this. He was talking. He's like, I've never said this before, but in 2000, Bill Clinton, U.S. President Bill Clinton came, and I said to him, "Well, can Russia join NATO?"
I did not see this.
And he's like, I'm not going to tell you what Clinton said, but he made it clear that that there is hostility towards Russia. So, I mean, that's the thing. Like, why couldn't Russia join NATO? I mean,
right.
given that everybody else seems to be in NATO,
right?
I'm just wondering, what is the threat?
And the price of admission is like this sort of to kiss the ring of like climate change concern and to like make noise about gender parity or something like this is right. I mean, again, to harp once more on the values question, like, in addition to this whole comment about, well, we're standing up for what we believe, we're protecting the free world, right? This grand compare, like I can imagine an America which, like, sees itself as a protector of the true, the good, and the beautiful around the world. But similarly to our discussion, I think it was on the other podcast on Tell Me What You Really Think, we were talking about the Olympics. And it was like, what would we even, how would we even effectively get indignant about China's human rights problem? Like, we are not sending Jesse Owens to the Olympics to like stick it to Hitler. Like we ourselves are so confused in our, and as we'll just talk about in a second, like the West generally is so messed up when it comes to the actual question of freedom that it's hard for me to believe that that's what we're about here. Like, it seems like we are about kind of being on the right side of like a global order where you like say trendy things about so-called social justice issues, and then like you sort of enrich yourself at the expense of the masses. Like, it does seem like kind of cronyism is the order of the day. And on that score, I find it hard to see how our ruling classes are like, in some grand position of, I mean, like Putin is worse than like are than Joe Biden. Like, but it's hard to see how Joe Biden can like ride in on some high horse like more.
I mean, I guess Biden is better than Putin. I mean, at least Putin seems to have the interests of the Russian people at heart.
Jeez, yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, Putin is at least somewhat. Isn't Putin rather popular? He's certainly more popular than Biden.
Yeah.
Among his own people. I mean, what I like is what Kamala Harris. I mean, to think that we sent Kamala Harris over there to be the voice of the United States at this Munich security conference.
Right.
I mean, she said, I mean, listen, guys, we're talking about the potential for war in Europe. I mean, let's really take a moment to understand the significance of what we're talking about. She talks like she's speaking to a group of, I don't know, school administrators in California, or like some community group that she can just talk down to. Like, I assume that the reporters in Europe at the Munich Security Conference are pretty well versed in the history of Europe and like what's potentially at stake in like possibility of war with Russia. Just her kind of weird, condescending babble.
Right.
It just kind of cracked me up a little bit. I mean, it just points up the totally ineffectual. I mean, doesn't it just feel like we're just in really bad hands?
Oh, I mean, absolutely it does. And the Harris of it all is kind of worse than the Biden of it all for me, because she's young and compos mentis. Like, when he dithers off into these incomprehensible strings of non-syllables, at least I feel like, what a poor man, he's being abused by his handlers. Whereas when Harris looks straight into the camera with her face hanging out and says something to the effect of like, well, in Russia, the situation, as you know, really is occurring and ongoing. It is occurring in an ongoing way. You know, I mean, that to me is like staring into a kind of void, and the void stares back. But on this subject, I mean, this is actually a helpful transition maybe into our other topic. I mean, we can keep talking about Russia, but like on this subject of like, how are we any better? I mean, I do feel like we are engaged in this kind of intense last gasp struggle over like, you know, whether we even have a right to like a protest or a difference of opinion at all in this country, in Canada, in the West generally. I mean, I feel like one reason why Westerners look at Russia with such horror is like, under Putin, that question is basically foreclosed. Like, you'll be poisoned if you try to stand up against him. You'll be like, you know, he does sort of jail his political opponents and so forth, and like and dissidents, and this is like, to me, the thing that we're fighting over with all of this January 6th stuff and the trucker convoy stuff and Canada stuff is like, you know, is that just how we want to conduct our affairs? Like, Justin Trudeau seems, to me at least, and you can tell me what you think, that like Trudeau seems to truly have gone like full Stalin. Like, he just has put on the funny hat and grown the mustache. And like, if you oppose him, you know, he's got his emergency powers, and you are going to like your bank accounts will be frozen. Even if you now back down, like the economic hurt will continue to come. You'll be on a list. And like, you know, I was thinking a little bit about the way that the January 6th people seem to be treated here. Like, not that I'm against prosecuting crime so much as just like, you know, the total surveillance. We don't really even know like most of this stuff, what they're, you know, to the extent to which they're being surveilled. And yeah, so I mean, I guess I should back up and just introduce this topic, which is that this trucker convoy has been going on for a while. We talked about it last week, and you know, so there were some outbursts of conflict and violence, and the police just basically, like, you know, the fondest dreams of the farthest right during the BLM protests of summer 2020 could never have imagined like the way that this would just be simply shut down and persecuted with extreme prejudice. And of course, the comparison has already been made between these two events, right? That it's not so much whether or not, like, we're in favor of which kind of lawlessness in the support of protest and support of a good cause, as it is like, clearly there's only one kind of political demonstration in whose name you can perform violence and disruption of the peace. And, if that does start to look like an authoritarian situation when you're just like shutting down protests purely on the basis of they're kind of being against you and you're not liking them. I mean, I'm kind of interested to see, like, there's apparently an American trucker convoy now gathering and heading to Washington. And like, to me, at least, it's like an open question whether like you can still do protests. It's not even on the right. It's like for the working class. It's like, can the working class still rise up, or are we too communist for that?
I would say it's not an open question. I think this question was settled a long time ago. And I think it's painful. There's a painful naivete on the part of people on the right, or in what's cast as the right, because I'm not even sure these people are necessarily on the right, but a naivete that we still live in an America where the right to protest and peaceably assemble is guaranteed to everyone, when I think it's been amply demonstrated that that's not the case. It's only guaranteed to people who are on the correct side of the regime. January 6th thoroughly demonstrated that this is not a tactic that's open to the right. Regarding Canada, what's happening up there makes the response to January 6th seem totally reasonable. I mean, at least January 6th was, in fact, a kind of riot. There was shoving. There was some violence. They did go into the Capitol. Whether that, demands any kind of, major federal response or not, I think is pretty doubtful. But what's going on in Canada, I mean, they didn't invade Parliament. They were just in Ottawa. Yes, it was annoying. They were honking, but then they stopped honking after they were told to. So what exactly is it that they were doing? Well, I think what it is that they were embarrassing the government. You notice the Canadian government doesn't say anything about COVID. They've completely jumped over, leapfrogged any question of mandates or anything like that, and just said this is an effort to overthrow the government of Canada, when there's no evidence that that's the case. And I think what happened was, if you remember, Pete Buttigieg went up to Canada, counseled, sat with Trudeau and his aides, and it was after that and I think that they said, yeah, we counsel them to use like their federal, authority to deal with this. It seems pretty clear to me that this was all done at the direction of the American government, which is trying to encourage, this kind of response as the norm. Probably Canada is a test case. I think if I were to counsel these truckers in going to Washington, I would say back off. This is not the strategy. They will come down on them. We've seen what they'll do in Canada. I mean, did you see that, like, the police chief of Ottawa? So they asked him, "Oh, okay, well, for the people who went home, are you going to pursue this?" Like, they left, they went home.
Right.
He's like, "Oh,
yes, absolutely, we are.
Absolutely, we're going to pursue it at every level of government.
Yeah,
and it's going to be very expensive." And basically, he said, "We're going to destroy their lives." Like some minimum wage woman who contributed $50. She's been doxxed. I mean, if James were here, he would talk a lot about the, intersection of the technology companies and this whole charade that, oh, well, this isn't censorship. This isn't punishment because it's just being done by private companies. But clearly the private companies are all working with the government, like hand in glove, or, fist in gauntlet or whatever, however you want to put it. They've these databases were hacked, and then the government is using like the hacked information to go after people and telling banks and insurance companies to freeze their assets, cancel their policies. They seized vehicles. They even, like in Alberta, I saw this clip, the RCMP went and destroyed 3 like earth moving excavators that apparently were just sitting in a field, but they went and destroyed the engines or cut the fuel lines on the grounds that, well, they might be used to in a protest. I mean, it's really scary, but apparently, in America, the Democrats think that this is all great.
Right.
So it's funny, the old saying like that when fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in an American flag.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, it seems more likely that it'll come wrapped in like
the pride flag
or a BLM flag.
Yeah.
I don't want to go. You go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm just
no. I mean,
here.
it's worthy of, I think, the height of indignation, and like, maybe I am being naive by even raising the question. Maybe the truckers. I mean, we did talk about this when we talked about Kyle Rittenhouse, right? That his major crime was simply being too young and idealistic, and thinking that like all the stuff we talked about civil liberties in America in school, like that's actually real for everybody and not only for favored parties. I mean, it's sort of interesting to me, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which I don't know, looks to me like their version of the ACLU, but like not hideously corrupted and rotted from the outside and worn as a skin suit by smiling authoritarians. Like it's like its own entity. And they spoke out against the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which this is the first time Trudeau has invoked this act for the first time. There's a predecessor, which was used 3 times, which was World War I, World War II, and a crisis in 1970 involving some like as terrorists,
during the Quebecois separation. Yeah,
right. So like this is a statement. Effectively, this group of truckers is an event on the order of magnitude of either world war or like separatism, and like violent separatism. And what it effectively does is allow them to suspend the normal process of democratic government. So it's not like, it only happens when you during those times. It's like, this is akin to like when Rome would appoint a dictator for 6 months because there was some crisis that required direct action. And it's like, what do they do? Like, highly inconvenient, extremely disruptive, no doubt, to business in Ottawa and potentially down the line. Like, what are they doing that would threaten the very existence of Canada? Like this, it does seem to me as if, much as COVID sort of has long faded into the background as this mere pretextual gesture that people have to make before they seize all this power. Like, when you speak out against COVID measures, you won't be regarded as somebody that's like putting forward an opinion or trying to like resist government overreach. You'll be regarded as like a dangerous domestic extremist who's to be, put down with extreme prejudice. So all of that is, as you say, incredibly horrifying, and clearly just kind of now it's Trudeau's like go-to gesture. If it ever, I don't know if there was ever anything different, but it just seems like, this is just sort of the way Trudeau thinks he needs to govern and get his policies across, because otherwise, like, what has he been doing all this time, shutting the country down and so on and so forth? And, you can say as conservatives, like, we have a slightly deeper concern for, the rule of law and so on and so forth, except that the whole summer of 2020, right, there was this endless rhetoric, well, protests are supposed to disrupt your life. They're supposed to make things uncomfortable. Like, we're coming into your suburbs and yelling in the middle of the night because that's supposed to cause you problems, right? And you're supposed to wake up and change. And like, when you say that about one kind of protest, and then when you act this way toward a protest on the other side, like, you're just a tyrant. Like, it seems to me there then no breathing room, no shadow of difference between you and an authoritarian. Like, that's just how authoritarian governments work. And yeah, I'm sure James would have a lot to say about the digital technology that, is sort of the digital infrastructure that's coming into place to enable these leaders to pursue this sort of thing, not only via legal means, but sort of economically. And we're running stuff about crypto this week on the site. So there's more on this too, this sort of like combination of social credit and fiscal credit, which is crystallizing and coming into play. The part of what you said, Seth, that I had not considered is that this is like basically a sort of, a trial balloon or a warning sign engineered by the US government. Like, this is how we also intend to deal with you. And my question is it that, or is it like wish fulfillment? Like, if we had the kind of, if we were as liberated as Trudeau is, or as the Australians are, to crack down on this, like, this is what we would do. I mean, maybe that's splitting hairs, but do you see what I mean?
I mean, I think it's pure legalism to imagine that there's very much separating Biden from being able to impose a similar type of authoritarian crackdown. No, I see this as part of the same thing. Glenn Greenwald had a very interesting piece in his Substack, which I've linked to in my Twitter. He had a very interesting piece this week called "The Neoliberal War on Dissent in the West," and he even goes back to a few years ago when there were protests in Barcelona,
right? And
the Spanish police really came down hard on them. I think this is the regime seeing in its end stages. I mean, I think this is really the dying flower of the West, emitting its 100-year stink before it dies. I mean, it's horrible to say, but I don't see how you can see it otherwise. I mean, DC is under a state of emergency right now because of the, State of the Union address. Supposedly, there's going to be all kinds of, they're rebuilding the big fence around the Capitol. And I just, I have no doubt that they would impose similar measures to Canada. Look, could they go around and freeze everybody's bank accounts? Well, probably. I mean, there's a reason why for the last 10 years or so, they keep talking about domestic terror and how the real threat of national security in America is domestic. And this is what people were saying, like real civil libertarians and the left were saying in the wake of the Patriot Act. Like, this is ugly stuff. And if they decide to turn it towards the people, I mean, totalitarian regimes are always, first and foremost, waging a war against their own people and pretending that it's about foreign infiltration. I mean, that's exactly what we're hearing in Canada. It's exactly what we're seeing here. I don't know. All I know is I think it's probably best to keep your nose clean in these sort of situations and not to give anybody an excuse to call you an insurrectionist or a terrorist. I mean, I don't know if that sounds quietist.
I mean, if it's truly the death of the West, that is to say, like the descent of just all, the Europe that began with Charlemagne and sort of carried some of its best ideas to America. Like, if it's truly just the end of that and we're already too far gone, then I could see a case for cursing God and dying. But yeah, I mean, like, I guess I feel like this is, many of these things are true. Some of them are a counsel of despair, right? I mean, and the I'm looking at this Greenwald piece now, and it paints a grim picture. There's no question. I'm interested that he doesn't mention the Gilets jaunes, who are another example of this whole phenomenon. Like, this, the closest analog for me in the West to the Canadian thing is the Gilets jaunes uprising, which I believe was over a specific, initially at least in France, over a specific tax on energy. and you know, that too was regarded as like a sort of hostile, you know, I don't think that it was at the time the infrastructure was in place, or the sort of slide into totalitarianism had gone far enough that it was able to be quite persecuted in the same way. Although I don't know that much about it. Like maybe in fact what Greenwald is saying is really true, which is that like this is something that we just are not even allowed to see, right? You're not even allowed to look at this as a sign of totalitarianism, because it would be too horrifying to consider that that's what it is. Like, you know, I certainly think that there's room. I mean, what you're saying would counsel realism, right? For anybody that wanted to go and protest in America about how you will be treated, like the fact that you will not be treated equally. Like you can complain about hypocrisy, but you also have to factor it into your preparations. But if what you're saying is true, then like, shouldn't we absolutely be taking to the streets? Like, shouldn't there certainly be a kind of resistance that takes shape, and shouldn't we all be like driving up to Canada essentially?
What good do demonstrations do?
I mean, what good does not demonstrate? Like, what good does sort of quietism do?
You know, I'm not saying we should necessarily be quietists.
Uh-huh.
I just think it's a question of keeping your powder dry.
Right. Okay.
You know, I mean, I would hardly, you know, at least in terms of like my public statements, I think I've already kind of like if we truly did go into totalitarianism, then I think I've already convicted myself in the eyes of the regime. I just don't see any value in putting one's body into a situation where there's a good chance that you're going to anger police and soldiers. And we already know what the direction of the Justice Department is. Like, who we know that some people can like firebomb police cars and get 3 months in jail. Other people can, look askance at AOC and wind up with their lives ruined and, whatever, or, enter the Capitol and then, wind up. I mean, there's people who are sitting in jail in federal jail with no bail and no in solitary confinement for like over a year now. Yeah. Like, what the hell is that about? I mean, you don't see that happening to anyone on the left at all.
Right.
So yeah, I just don't think it makes. I just would counsel like caution.
Yeah.
Well,
right. I mean,
this woman up in Canada who organized this truckers convoy is facing 10 years in prison. I mean, from what I gather, if you let someone in to use the toilet, they could seize your house.
Right.
I mean, that's the level at which we're talking now.
Yeah, they're denying her bail too. That lady, I forget her name, but she's up for 10 years.
Yeah, and why are they because you know why they're denying her bail? Because she said while they were arresting her, she said something like keep the fires going, keep the home fires going. Just some kind of statement of courage. And she's like, they're like, that is that is encouraging mischief, which I guess is like, a law or a crime in Canada. Let me just say one other thing that I think is kind of interesting.
Sure.
Chrystia Freeland, she is the deputy prime minister. Okay. And she's a former journalist. She was a Rhodes Scholar. She's essentially Justin Trudeau's brain, right? Like, she's the mastermind. She's the one who does everything. Now, she's an interesting case because her mother is like a fervent Ukrainian nationalist. And in the early 90s, used to go back and forth carrying suitcases of cash. Now, I don't really know whose side she was on in all of this, but Chrystia Freeland, her mother's father was a Ukrainian Nazi collaborator during World War II. And she lied about it for decades, claiming she had no idea. And to this day, she still will write things like honoring her grandfather. So to me, I mean, she's completely operating in this fascist mode. Right. I don't like to say that people are, I'm not so atavistic that I'm going to like say that everybody, enacts their grandparents' fate or whatever, but it seems pretty obvious that she is. I mean, look what she's doing. I mean, she's all in on this totalitarian response up there, and she keeps calling it like democratic, completely open. This is how to save our democracy. I mean, why is Canada using the same rhetoric of saving democracy that Kamala Harris and Biden and Nancy Pelosi use? Like they've just completely borrowed it. It doesn't seem like, I don't even understand where it comes from.
Well, I mean, there is a certain, I think that it's possible for these people to be both evil and philosophically committed to their own virtue. In fact, it's the most likely scenario, right? Most people that are doing great evil, think of themselves as sort of defenders of virtue. And it's precisely in the name of, whatever they have hazily associated in their head with the coming utopia that they do all this crazy stuff, right? I mean, this is like when you listen to COVID extremists, or you listen to Fauci or the CEO of Moderna, whatever his name is, it's like, they're not sitting there thinking of themselves as the next Stalin or whatever. They're thinking of themselves as heroes, saviors of the world, and everything that we've been talking about, the total double standard, the comfort with invoking suspensions of democracy, and the idea that these people who disagree with you or who harshly criticize your policies or indeed exercise the God-given right to protest, that those people represent some sort of threat to the world order. It's very Persian. People don't talk that much about the Persian Empire anymore because all we know is that Greece won their fight with Persia, but the whole Persian thesis under Darius and Xerxes and these kind of massive megalomaniacs was that the Persian Empire represented truth, right? By bringing order to the world, they were the sort of defenders of truth, and therefore anybody who was outside of the regime or who resisted capture by the regime was anti-truth. So on some level, although a lot of this is, very modern and digital age, some of it is actually quite atavistic and deep rooted in the human psyche. It's well, if I am the truth and I am our democracy, then people that fight back against me are just any measure is justified against them.
Oh yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I guess the one constant in human relations is this inability to see the the log sticking out of your eyeball.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, when you're scrutinizing the mote in someone else's. I don't know, Spencer. It seems like we're heading into some pretty tough times.
Yeah. No, you're not wrong. I mean, you make a compelling case for thoroughgoing despair. I continue in my perhaps naive optimism to carry some water for fighting back. I mean, I guess I have to hope that you are wrong about the complete impunity with which our trucker protest will be prosecuted. But it's not a conviction or a prediction so much as a hope. I don't know. I would rather hope for that than not. Although, what do I know?
Look, I hope so too. I hope so too.
Well, we will continue tracking the situation. I guess we'll have more answers next week. We'll certainly know more as time elapses, and we don't usually call out for specific letters or feedback, but I would be interested to know, reach out to us if you want, and or tweet at us at American Mind and let us know how far gone you think we are. Seth and I have been kind of talking about the the Barron approach, which is a little more bleak, and the Klavan approach, which is a little more hopeful, and let us know which side you fall on. I would be interested to know. In any case, thank you all for listening to this pared down episode of the Roundtable. We had a lot of fun. If you want to support our work, please visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our brand new Washington, D.C. based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to the production and engineering crew, Jake Gannon, Annalisa Lee, and Noah Peterson. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.